So talk to me about some of the things you learned being a reader, because I had Michael Haig on the podcast probably a couple months ago now. So he was, for anyone listening, Will Smith's script. He was on retainer with Will Smith's company for many years. And he started out being a reader, and he said he just learned so many things through reading unproduced screenplays. So I'm curious, what are some of those things that you learned getting the chance, especially so early in your career, to get your hands on a bunch of unproduced screenplays, and what you learned from them?
Mhm. Yeah, so one of the biggest things it was kinda sizing up my competition, right? Of coming in and saying, "Alright, like, how well are these writers writing? People with agents and managers and that are getting real considers by production companies, what am I up against?" And I this shouldn't sound arrogant because I think if you ask a lot of readers or a lot of producers, they will say similar things, which is most of what I read was surprisingly bad. Um, and I think I really watched. That part of it was I was honestly confused. I mean, I read so many scripts over the course of working there, and I started to kind of see just the same mistakes again and again. Writers are making the same mistakes, the same mistakes, the same mistakes, and I was like starting to think about, okay, what really is wrong here? What is the real reason that these aren't working? Because I found that a lot of script readers or script feedback services or these sorts of things would just kind of try to shift the idea of the story or say, what if you did this version of the idea? And that's not the same as saying, okay, what in this story, in this writer's vision, is not working. And so that really helped me learn more about the craft of looking at something that is finished and being able to clearly identify what isn't working in that story. And so I think the biggest thing that I found, which is just a constant mistake, is that writers try to write extremely complicated stories, and every good story is simple. There are no good complicated stories. For a long time, I was hesitant to, like, take the full sort of leap into that, but there are no good complicated stories. Even if you look at something that you think is complicated, like Inception. Inception is about one character, implanting an idea in this other character. That's the whole really. And so no one throws a lot of stuff at you, but that's the central idea. And so good stories are very simple. And not to say that no one has fantastic stories as much as he does concepts as much, but that's a whole nother thing. The point is simplicity was big. Understanding that and just clear mistakes. So like people are always like, what are they? How are they messing up? What's the issue? It's like they're making the same mistakes amateur writers are, which is the protagonist doesn't have a clear want or doesn't actually take clear action, or it's not clear what the goals of the characters are, or there's no sort of centralized real conflict on the moral or ethical or philosophical level of the story. It's just sort of the action hero hitting the beats, and that's just again and again that sort of thing. So writers are constantly looking for the mistake that's just going to wow them. Oh, I didn't think that that was the mistake I was making. It's never coming. What it is that you are just missing one of the simple things. It's always that you're missing one of the simple.
Why do you think people feel the need to have a complicated story?
I think it's just the nature of how human beings think. So, Einstein is credited to have said, "If you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it." What is he saying? What he's saying is that the core concepts of anything are very clear and very simple, and that when you are trying to solve problems or when you're trying to make progress in something, you are always coming to the clearest, most foundational elements of that thing. That could be math, that could be, physics, that could be writing a story. And what happens is rather than clearing our minds, our minds are muddled, and so what we do is muddled. And so we have to, this kind of loop of understanding that the things that you create are at their best when they're simple and focused and are focused on sort of one idea. And then you realize that your mind should work the same way. That clarity of thought helps you in the external things that you do, which is also what story is. You making having a thought, having a belief, and taking an action into the world to then see the feedback of the world to then have an understanding of how that impacts what you think.
And so for the person listening to this, if they want to know more about your lessons, you did put up a video on this, so I'll make sure maybe I'll link in the show notes down below so people want to go direct to that. But there's one in the there's 2 points, I guess, in that video that are kind of, I'm going to connect here with this question. So one of your lessons from reading unproduced screenplays was that your screenplay shouldn't start getting interesting at page 70. That was one of them. But you had another one. So a lot of people probably hear that and be like, okay, well, I need to be shocking with my screenplay right away. But there's also a difference, you said, between shock value and good writing. So how do you kind of balance those two things with wanting to make sure your screenplay isn't a snooze fest until over the hour mark, but also not wanting to just throw shock value in there to try and shock the reader?
Mhm. So when we're looking at that, we have to ask ourselves, what is shock value? What do we mean when we say shock value? What do we mean when we say interesting at page 7, right? One of the big things I'm really big on is having a clear definition of what we're talking about when we talk about elements of story. So we have to ask ourselves, what makes an interesting screenplay? And what is interesting. And what happens is, what I've found is that you have to sort of leave screenwriting, novels, these mediums, and you have to come in to say, okay, what is a story really? Why do stories exist as an element of human consciousness? Why do we tell each other stories? Why are they valuable? They're entertaining, yes, and you can have a story that is solely entertaining, and those are fun, and I enjoy those. But why do stories exist as a part of our human consciousness? The reason that they do is that they are essentially symbols of philosophical lessons. So they are a philosophical lesson and a symbol that you can understand. So what we do, I think, are like language is not an accurate way to communicate ideas to each other, right? Like some of the things that we've built up are ways, methods of communication. Really, what we're doing is trying to transfer symbols from one person to the other. So what a story is a large symbol of a concept, of one concept, ideally, that you can transfer to somebody else. That ideally gives them a understanding of some sort of metaphysical, philosophical, moral, ethical concept, and allows them to see it in a different light. So, taking all of that, now we can come back to a screenplay. Okay, so why is a screenplay not interesting up until page 70? Or how do we create an interesting story without shock value? It's very simple. What we do is we create a screenplay, we create a story based upon a philosophical conflict. So what does that mean? A philosophical conflict is two ideas or more, but mainly two ideas in conflict with each other about what is sort of the best way to think and view life and live. So, for an example, let's take Whiplash, which is an example I've talked about a lot. There's my Whiplash right. Um, Whiplash is a philosophical conflict around the pursuit of greatness and the sacrifices that it can take, or a normal life and the value that there is in living a normal life and being a person that won't be remembered. And so, what you see in that film is ultimately a character who's struggling to figure out what is the best way to live. What is the best way to live a meaningful life? What is the most valuable thing to do? And their struggle is the pro of greatness and the con of the level of sacrifice it requires versus the pro of the value and enjoyment in a normal life versus the cons of not being remembered and not making an impact on a larger society, right? And the entire film is based around that idea. You can look at a lot of different stories like this. For those listening, if you want to see a ton of examples of me talking about this, my YouTube channel is the place to find a myriad of me looking at this very simple concept in a ton of different. And so that's why when we're asking what, it's not shock value, it's you want to begin a story, and as soon as possible, the audience should have an understanding of the dilemma that's taking place, morally, ethically, philosophically. When we start the story of Whiplash, quickly the opening scene is we dolly into a drummer playing drums intensely. He's trying to learn. He's clearly frustrated. He's trying to get it right. A teacher comes in, critiques him, and leaves, and we see that he wants to get this right. And this is the baseline of this side of the philosophical conflict. We have a character trying to pursue this great thing. Then, very quickly, we see this character with his father, who is the symbol of the normal life, or in the character's mind, the symbol of mediocrity. And we see that side of it. And so now we start to very quickly within the story, within the first 10 to 15 pages, we have an understanding of the philosophy and the philosophical dilemma that's taking place. And that is how you make your story interesting from the beginning. Because how do you create empathy, right? This is something that writers are constantly struggling with. You don't create empathy for characters by making them likable. You create empathy for characters by making it clear what they believe and why they believe what they believe and their real struggle on figuring out what to do. So even characters like Frank Underwood in House of Cards. He's a despicable character, but we have empathy for him, or we follow him, or we're interested to see what he does next because we have an understanding of his life philosophy, we have an understanding of what he values, and that is enough to get us to follow where he goes.